Well, as the year draws to a close, we reflect on the moments that shaped South Africa in 2024, from the countdown to the critical national elections, the outcomes and the recent EFF and MK conferences, and the ongoing headlines surrounding Minister Thembi Simelane. Today, we take a closer look at these top stories and their impact on the nation. Joining us to unpack this is political analyst Dr. Ongama Mtimka, who's joining us via video link, and SABC News senior reporter Samkele Maseko is joining me in a studio. Gentlemen, good afternoon to you both, and thank you so much for your time. Perhaps, Dr. Ongama Mtimka, let me start with you. So, of course, we saw the May 29 elections come and go, and these were pivotal elections just because of the high stakes that they also presented. Perhaps let's talk about just the elections being one of the biggest political stories because of their outcomes. We saw, of course, the ANC losing majority there for the very first time, coming under 50%. And the MK party, just 5-6 months old at the time, dominating those elections and essentially becoming the main opposition party in a parliament, and of course the third largest party in the country. Your observations there?
So these elections presented an acid test for South Africa's democracy. And the big question was, to what extent will the ANC permit the election to proceed freely and fairly, given the projections that they were going to come below 50%? And then secondly, to what extent would they accept the election outcome? Whenever we spoke about the strength of the South African democracy when measured from procedural perspectives, people always cited the fact that we had not yet seen a transition at a national level and a transfer of power that allows us to test every aspect of how democratic South Africa is. And so this election was that acid test, in terms of which the ANC's ability to accept an election outcome, permit the election processes to unfold even though they were threatened, was tested and proven for me, unwanting, or our democracy was proven resilient. So in that sense, then, this was a watershed election, not just because the ANC stood to lose, but it was testing to what extent will they remain true to democratic principles and values.
Yeah. Samkele, let me bring you in there. Of course, Dr. Ongama Mtimka saying this was an acid test. I want to focus on the two biggest parties that were impacted here. You had, of course, a change in political shift for the ANC, but also the EFF. I mean, the EFF losing essentially some of their top senior leaders going to the MK party. What for you stood out, and what for you was that moment of truth for these two significant parties?
The moment of truth was essentially when former President Jacob Zuma on the 16th of December 2023 decided to come out in the public glare and back the Umkhonto we Sizwe party. That is when the political tectonic plates shifted at a national level within the country. That is when it was ultimately sealed that the ANC would dip under 50%, because if you look historically to Jacob Zuma, how the ANC rose exponentially in KwaZulu-Natal to those 1.6 million votes that they got in that province, starting off on the back foot on the era of former President Mbeki, President Mandela, where the IFP was dominant. Ultimately, the province was hung in KwaZulu-Natal when Sbundebele ultimately became premier. Subsequent to that, the ANC won. But former President Jacob Zuma, moving away from the ANC, made those tectonic shifts, and the sands shifted within the political landscape nationally. But it was very clear that the ANC would accept the outcomes of the general election on the 29th of May, because you must just take it back to 2016 when they lost the metros within the country. I remember David Makura addressing the SACP in Boksburg, saying that it is very warm inside Birchwood because it's very cold outside. The ANC has just lost the metros within the country, lost Nelson Mandela Bay, they lost Tshwane, they lost Johannesburg, they lost Ekurhuleni, they lost Johannesburg as well, and ultimately the political tectonic plates in the country had shifted ultimately. But the liberation movement, the governing party within the country, would have that majority that former liberation movements on the African continent tend not to lose power, and chaos assumes within their countries once they've lost power. But ultimately, Jacob Zuma would not only hurt the ANC with his MKP, he would politically annihilate, obliterate the economic freedom fighters in KwaZulu-Natal. With those 300,000 votes he ultimately gave to them in 2019, with those who were supporting him unhappy that he had been removed as president of the country and was no longer president of the ANC, and that Umfowethu syndrome waned down in that province of KwaZulu-Natal, which is where the EFF benefited, but would ultimately yet again feel the Lomkhonto, when Umkhonto wesizwe came to annihilate them and the ANC. And arguably one may say the biggest loser out of these 29th of May elections in KwaZulu-Natal was the Inkatha Freedom Party, because they had projected themselves to be the outright winner of that province, to be the majority party, if not just below the ANC. But ultimately, Jacob Zuma had other plans to spoil their Tea Party as well.
And just, Dr. Mtimka, just staying on that analogy that is being made here in terms of just being the biggest losers, did the Government of National Unity, in fact, come as a lifeline for the ANC? Because when you look at it, I mean, they then formed the Government of National Unity. KZN, if we stay on KZN, I mean, that was an opportunity for the MK party to actually lead in KZN and become, the leaders in government. But that didn't happen. What happened was that we saw that the national government, the Government of National Unity, then trickled down to KZN and become this Government of Provincial Unity. And then you have the Inkatha Freedom Party, as well as the ANC, almost coming up and rising to the occasion again and being leaders. I mean, how significant was that formation of the Government of National Unity for the ANC and, of course, in KZN for the IFP?
I think it was significant all around. So the biggest, idea that would have been foremost among these leaders that were negotiating were both internal issues and the need to come back and minimize the extent of the losses from the election, but also national stability, so that they were able to find each other while pursuing both internal sustainability, that is actually a deal that made sense for the parties. But I think that there was a coalescing of interests between the interests of these parties and the interests of South Africa. Because if you look at the in general, for example, there was a view among South African and international investors that though they were for an ANC that becomes a lot more accountable by losing the extent of dominance that it had, there were fears that below the midpoint in the 40s, the ANC was subject to all kinds of alliances that would threaten the policy offering that they have had, which has mostly been sound, by the way, for the country. So there was a fear then, both by domestic and international capital, that if the ANC loses so much support significantly, then the trajectory that it may take from a policy style or policy orientation point of view may be a lot more risky. That they were able to get the Democratic Alliance and the Inkatha Freedom Front party, as well as the other parties that came and became part of that coalition, served to create a stability or a pathway to stability for the country. What I'd like to say concerning the IFP, just to build on what Samkele was saying, the issue is that, and this is the securing the GPU deal at the level of the province, is the beginning and not the end, because MK Party is continuing to advance in KZN, attempting to build an organization that is going to continuously be a thorn in the flesh to the IFP, and they have the benefit of a statesman from that province who's gone on and achieved things at a national level, whereas the IFP is now in the hands of people who have gravitas in themselves, but not the stature that Mangosuthu Buthelezi had. So going forward, part of their strategy is going to be to search for meaning and relevance in terms of how they build a base or protect their base in KZN. So this is an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think it's the same for the EFF and the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. This election has had so much shifted things around that searching for meaning, searching for the core offering to South African electorate is going to be the big issue facing these parties going to the 26 elections.
Yeah, and then fast forward, Samkele, to a couple of months post those elections, we saw in December two significant things happening. The MK party celebrating its milestone 1-year celebrations at the Moses Mabhida Stadium. We also then saw the elective conference of the EFF. And of course, two significant things happening there where a lot of anticipation to see who would assume that deputy president role. And also the big question, the big elephant in the room, where is Ndlozi in all of this situation and him being sidelined? But I want you to talk about those two significant, developments in the month of December.
The EFF was always going to have problems post the elections. They're a 10-year-old organization. FNB Stadium on the 26th of July, of this July 26 movement, was the highest point of the economic emancipation movement. But they had faced some problems with your likes of Mpora Makata, Kanyisile Litchfield, Chabalala leaving the party. But their most difficult period came when Floyd Shivambu, the deputy president of the EFF, decided to leave. Ultimately, Julius Malema going after those whom were seemingly close with Floyd Shivambu, your Mwiseni Ndlozi, your Dalimpofus. So the significance of the EFF's third NPA marked a turning point within the political trajectory of the EFF, where those whom were seemingly the ones who could challenge Julius Malema internally within the party were politically obliterated. They were left out of the structures. They left the EFF. They saw Julius Malema as elevating himself above the organization rather than the organization being uplifted above an individual. And that became a turning point within the EFF. But the EFF's problems started when they got access to the levers of power. That is when the sins of incumbency crept in within the EFF, which directly replicate that of the ANC. And some would argue even escalated and exacerbated the issues that plagued the ANC in governance. You look at Ekurhuleni as an example. You look at the city of Johannesburg, an example where the EFF got access to resources, and you've got people within the EFF who are salivating at having the access to those particular resources. The MK party, on the other hand, is politically eating up the EFF with taking its senior leaders, bringing them onto Umkhonto Wesizwe, but Umkhonto Wesizwe is not attacking the EFF verbally and politically within the public domain. Hence, you saw an address by the leader of the MK party, Jacob Zuma, saying that someone who swears and insults his political opponents and people does not know politics. But you must just turn a blind eye and speak about what you stand for instead of swearing people day in and day out. As you see the attacks on Mwiseni Ndlozi, on a Floyd Shivambu, on a Dalimpofu and his family, and particularly his son, Sizwe Mpofu Welsh. And that, from the case of the MK party, is showing maturity to say that we're offering proper politics, politics of substance, intellectual politics, and respectful politics, as opposed to loud-hailing, shouting that has become synonymous with that ANC Youth League of Economic Freedom Fighters, which morphed off into the Economic Freedom Fighters. So it's going to be a battle of attracting politics of substance, respect, and attracting those particular individuals, which will divide the South African electorate. Some will see this as an opportunity for the erstwhile governing party to regain lost ground with these two political formations, their offsprings, going at each other's throats. But also, it is not only these political parties that are in trouble, the ANC, the EFF, the MK. The DA in itself is in abyss. The battle between John Steenhuisen and Helen Ziller. The IFP as well is in abyss. You've got a Thulasizwe, Reverend Thulasizwe Buthelezi, who seem to be very ambitious, who seem to be wanting to take over the party in a battle that is there between Tamintuli and Velonkosina Hlabisa. and Reverend Buthelezi being that particular dark horse who's being perceived as a very divisive fellow. So all political formations are in trouble unless if you belong to the Patriotic Alliance, where there's no internal democracy, where the word of the leadership of the PA goes, they chop and change leadership like the MK party as they wish, but there's no particular scrutiny on them because there's no democracy in that party.
Okay, so as we wrap, our conversation and just looking at what has transpired this year, particularly alone, notwithstanding, of course, the dynamics that is facing all of these political parties that you're mentioning. I spoke to ATM leader Vuyo Zungula not too long ago, and he said that 2026 local government elections are going to be watershed elections. Now, given the dynamics of, the Government of National Unity, we know, of course, there are contentious issues there. You've got the Bella Act, which is still a subject of contention for the DA and the ANC. Then, of course, you have the Progressive Caucus, which has it's also facing its own dynamic with the two biggest parties within that caucus, the EFF as well as the MK party at loggerheads. Talk to me about what you see and how you see the 2026 local government elections going to shape even further what we are seeing as a changed political landscape. Let's start with you, Samkele.
We must be frank and honest. The 29th of May elections were about two political figures. It was about Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, particularly within the liberation forces or the so-called left. It was about those two particular individuals, the hatred that is there between themselves and ultimately the MK party. So people were voting for Jacob Zuma, the individual, in a province like KwaZulu-Natal. If you look at the outcomes of the recent by-elections, you can clearly see that Jacob Zuma factor was there. But when it comes to the elections in 2026, the recent by-elections have proven that the MK party has not done as well as they did within the 29th of May. That trend may continue, but it is also subject to how the MK party plays its internal politics, because they've shifted their leadership around drastically. Their original mobilizers, your Tobane Zumas in the Umgungundlovu district, are no longer there. Your Nape in the eThekwini region in Lamontville are no longer there. Those were the mobilizers of the MK party. But they also benefited from a disorganized ANC under the leadership of Bheki Mtolo and Siboniso Duma, Dr. Ntuthuko Mahlaba, Nomagugu Mngadi, and also Sipho Hlomuga in the leadership of the ANC in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. They could not steer the ship of their own regions, who they left in Nkandla and made a U-turn alone as the provincial leadership. But as the ANC rearranges itself in the regions, in the zones, it may prove that they can make a political comeback. Just you look at the recent by-elections in Mtuba-Tuba, where the MK party had won that ward on the 29th of May, but it was won by the IFP. The ANC on the 29th of May had received about 120 votes. This time around in the by-elections, they received 900, just 300 short of winning the ward against the IFP that won by 1,200 votes or so. And that just can give you what is to come on the local elections, because people are not voting for national politics in local government. They are voting on local dynamics, local issues, how close they are with their councillor, how aloof is the councillor is within that particular ward. They are voting on services, water, electricity, collection of refuse and other municipal amenities. But the EFF is going to have a mammoth task in regaining that lost ground in KwaZulu-Natal, because the MK party has taken that particular ground. The DA seems to be very solid in their wards, in their base, and they look to grow or to have a retention of the particular votes that they got. But the battle will be mainly between the ANC, the IFP, and the MK party, with the IFP going to make strong inroads in a traditional base of the ANC in your Midlands, in your Lower South Coast, and also within the biggest voting district in eThekwini. But the Jacob Zuma factor will also linger. Will he have that impact that he had on the 29th of May in the local elections or not? But history has proven that in local elections, he tends not to do so well. Just look at 2016.
And Dr. Mtimka, I want you to actually just take it from that point. I mean, we know with the MK party, they did pretty well in that they have a seat at least, or a couple in most provinces. 7 to be exact, barring 2 provinces, the Western Cape and the Northern Cape. But having spoken recently to Dalimpofu, who was saying that, they are going to be spending a lot of the time in provinces like the Eastern Cape, where they want to gain ground there, and Limpopo, which are strong bases for the ANC. How do you see the MK party just shaking off these, perception of being a Zulu nationalist party and then branching out and actually growing its base in other provinces come 2026 local government election? What for you is standing out and would be crucial for some of these parties to make sure that they, garner ahead of those elections?
So we may characterize, and I've done this, South African electoral politics as a process of dynamic fragmentation, in terms of which parties are fragmenting, driven by internal factors mostly, especially the ANC and the top 3 parties. And the question for me that's lingering is not whether or not there's a potential voter out there to be taken by the likes of MK Party and others. The question is, how much will they remain as viable organizations to tap into the voter base that is there for the taking? One, with MK Party, the issue is, will they transition the politics of vindictiveness from which they were born to becoming a sustainable organization? And to be a sustainable organization means you've got very transparent and open processes to campaign for leadership. If the style of appointing leaders and representatives still on the basis of Baba's preferences, you're not going to have an organization that's sustainable and can wield a significant threat in the various parts of the country there, precisely because people need a sense of security that they will be there, that if you stop being a teacher and you go and be a municipal councillor, you're not going to lose your job within 5 months of being deployed. So as long as it still has those tendencies, it's going to perform below potential. Then the ANC, the thing to watch about the ANC is that it has been trying to improve how it selects candidates to stand as ward councillors since the 2021 elections. And I think that they introduced very interesting criteria, which some of the ANC leaders have found to be useful, of having communities also participate in candidate selection processes, at least for the open party list, in the ward councillors. The issue is that the ANC is approaching yet another high-stakes election in 2027, and many of its provinces next year are going to conferences. And that dynamic problematizes the extent to which the ANC can handle the leadership selection processes for ward councillors in good faith and in ways that are not sidelining. If it is if it's vintage ANC, which I think it's mostly going to be, national politicians and regional power brokers, along with their provincial power brokers, are going to be fiddling in processes of selecting representatives, ward councillors, in ways that advance their individual interest to become leaders in the 2027 conference, more than what's best for the ANC in those sub-regional structures. Wow. And as a result of that, they may end up frustrating their very prospects of success in the 26 elections. Absolutely. And we can say this about all the other political parties.
Well, Dr. Ongama Mtimka and Samkele Maseko, thank you so much to you both for your time. Of course, just reflecting on the moments that have shaped South African politics this year and have dominated the news and the headlines.